Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. There are few things as unsettling as the thought of accidentally coming across human remains. Unlike when a loved one passes away, there's no sense of familiarity or attachment to the gruesome discovery, only the disturbing reminder of a life that once existed, leaving us to contemplate the unnerving mystery of how that person met their final end. Today, we wanted to take a look at a few examples of stories involving human remains, focusing on the bizarre series of events that precipitated and accompanied their discovery. Before we get to our list, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel, and if you've watched a bunch of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, make sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. As always, we are extremely grateful to everyone who has helped support the channel. With that out of the way, here are 4 bizarre cases involving human remains.
On December 21, 1985, James Nichols told police that his wife Joanne had gone missing from their home in Poughkeepsie, New York. The news came as a shock to many people in the community. Though James was sometimes avoided because of his strange and somewhat unsettling behavior, Joanne was well liked by her neighbors. The 55-year-old Louisiana native was known for her warm southern charm, as well as her devotion to her church. She was a beloved first-grade teacher who made a big deal out of the first day of school and brought in cupcakes for her students on their birthdays. To those that knew Joanne, it seemed bizarre that she would simply take off. It was no surprise then that attention naturally turned towards James following Joanne's disappearance. He told police that they had eaten dinner with another couple the night before and had come home after an argument. The next morning, he had gone out to buy dog food and returned to find his wife missing. James also showed police a note that had been typed on one of their home computers, which he said had been left by Joanne. It explained that she was depressed after the death of their son, who had died in a boating accident 3 years earlier at the age of 25. James theorized that Joanne had either left to join a religious cult, that she had killed herself, or that she had simply left him. However, to many people, none of these explanations made sense. For starters, Joanne did not seem to be the type to run away. Neighbors said that though she was bothered by her husband's behavior at times, their marriage seemed to be fairly peaceful overall, and that there were no major signs of trouble. It was true that she had been depressed about the death of their son, but not to the point where it seemed like she would do anything drastic. While police continued to search wooded areas and waterways in the surrounding community, they also spent time following James. Subsequently, their investigation uncovered a couple of strange things. First, on the day that Joanne was reported missing, her car was also gone, and it was presumed that she had taken it with her. However, the following day, detectives noticed the vehicle back in the driveway of the Nichols residence. James claimed he had found Joanne's car parked at a local shopping center and had it promptly cleaned and vacuumed. While watching James, investigators also discovered that he had been seeing another woman. When presented with photographs of the two of them together, James became immediately defensive and referred all future questions to his lawyer. Though the findings certainly seemed incriminating, police never uncovered enough evidence to serve him with a search warrant, nor was he ever arrested or even publicly named a suspect in Joanne's disappearance. In the years that followed, rumors swirled around James, and he became increasingly more reclusive. Neighbors rarely saw him leave his property, except for the rare occasion when he would attend the roast beef dinners at the local Methodist church. During this time, Joanne's brother, John Miller, spent almost $150,000 on a private detective to investigate his sister's disappearance. Though he was never able to find significant evidence to solve the case, he did succeed in preventing Joanne from being declared legally dead. This may have stopped James from being able to sell his house, which was also in Joanne's name. As the years passed, the home fell into increasingly worse states of disrepair as James continued to clutter it with items he hoarded and collected. His appearance in public became less and less frequent until finally, on December 27, 2012, he was found dead inside his residence at the age of 82. It seemed that whatever secrets James may have known about Joanne's disappearance, he had taken with him to the grave. However, when a cleanup crew arrived at the Nichols house 6 months later, they made a shocking discovery. Upon wading through the massive items, they noticed a peculiar-sounding wall in the basement. This turned out to be a false wall, concealing a barrel-shaped container behind it. Inside the container were the skeletal remains of a woman. It took police just a short time after that to confirm what many people had suspected for decades. James had killed Joanne and lived in the house with her hidden remains for nearly 30 years. An autopsy revealed that Joanne had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. As horrifying as the case was, many of those who had known Joanne were happy to receive closure, including her nephew, Randy Miller. Sadly, John Miller passed away before he ever found out what had happened to his sister.
In 2015, 61-year-old Mary Ceruti went missing from her small home in Houston, Texas. She was known to her neighbors as a quiet but kind woman who mostly kept to herself. Mary was described by many as looking older than she really was, a combination of her somewhat frail figure, her gray hair that fell past her shoulders, and her iconic discount eyeglasses that always sat on the edge of her nose. She had been married and divorced at least twice, but now lived alone in her bungalow, in the western part of Houston's historic community known as the Heights. In the 1970s, the neighborhood became infamous as the home of serial killer Dean Carroll, the perpetrator behind the grisly Houston mass murders. By the time Mary moved there in 2001, the community was still in the midst of shaking its identity as a low-income area, as well as the seedy reputation that came along with it. Neighbors would later recall that when Mary had first bought her home on Alston Street, there was a brothel just across the road. However, in the years leading up to Mary's disappearance, Houston Heights began to undergo a transformation that many people will likely be familiar with. Wealthier people started moving in, property values started going up, and more developers began eyeing real estate in the area. In 2012, plans were announced for a luxury apartment complex. The building was to be located literally in Mary's backyard. But Mary refused to sell her home. She was vehemently opposed to the development, joining a group of residents that organized in an effort to stop construction. However, the group was ultimately unsuccessful, and over the next few years, Mary endured numerous inconveniences brought about by the construction. Her water was periodically cut off, her car was often blocked into the driveway, and the ongoing work made it harder to get to her house. Mary documented the entire ordeal through photographs, writing notes underneath some of them detailing her thoughts about the changing neighborhood. In early 2015, residents began moving into the new apartment building. Not long after, neighbors stopped hearing from Mary. The grass outside began to grow long, and the home started to fall into disrepair. When police conducted a welfare check, they discovered the bodies of several of the cats Mary had once taken care of, but no sign of the woman herself. Still, it took some time for a missing persons report to be filed. Initially, concerned friends and neighbors were told that they could not file such a report because they were not related to the missing woman. That changed when it was discovered that Mary had missed several months' worth of mortgage payments. A notice finally went out on September 28th, 3 days after the bank had foreclosed on her home. The bizarre circumstances caused many rumors to emerge surrounding Mary's disappearance. Some suggested that she had simply gotten fed up with the changing neighborhood and taken off. Others suggested that maybe she had finally sold her property to the developers and was too embarrassed to show her face after her long public battle over the previous construction. Still others thought that there might be a more sinister explanation for Mary's disappearance. Perhaps she had been the victim of foul play. Some of the more conspiratorially minded residents in the neighborhood even insisted that the development companies might have killed Mary in order to get their hands on her home. However, no one was prepared for what would happen next. Following the sale of the property, the home was cleaned out and renovated, and on March 4th, 2017, new tenants began moving in. When they shifted a board in the attic, they got the shock of their lives. In the crevice between one of the home's walls, they found a pile of skeletal human remains, as well as a pair of red discount eyeglasses. It turned out that Mary had never left her Houston Heights home, and her remains had been within its walls for nearly 2 years. This was later confirmed by the Harris County medical examiner after a positive identification had been made. As for how Mary had ended up in the walls of her home, there are no completely satisfying answers. The most prominent theory is that she somehow fell through the attic and found herself unable to move or call for help. This is made somewhat more believable based on accounts from acquaintances who said that in the months leading up to her death, Mary's physical and mental health seemed to be in decline. However, there are still many people who think this explanation falls short, particularly because of how long it took for anyone to discover Mary's remains. Instead, they theorize that Mary's body was somehow moved after her death. Due to the advanced state of decomposition that her remains were found in, investigators were able to learn very little information about Mary's death. The exact cause remains unknown. Unfortunately, it seems as though we may never get a definitive answer as to what really happened in the bizarre and tragic case of Mary Ceruti.
In 1961, a man named George Carroll went missing from his home in Lake Grove, New York. Carroll was a Korean War veteran who had purchased the property in 1955 with his wife Dorothy as a place to raise their growing family. Now, that family had seemingly been torn apart overnight. George was in his late 20s when he disappeared, leaving behind 4 young children: 9-year-old Patricia, 7-year-old Jean, 5-year-old Stephen, and 8-month-old Michael. According to Dorothy, her husband had walked out on the family. As a result, no missing persons report was ever filed for George. Growing up, the Carroll children quickly learned not to ask too many questions about their father's absence. Dorothy didn't want to talk about the situation and would never provide a straight answer about George's disappearance beyond saying that he had gone out one day and never returned. It seemed that despite the upsetting situation, she had managed to move on with her life, getting together with a man named Richard Darris not long after her husband's disappearance. The two would eventually marry and have another child. However, Dorothy's unwillingness to talk about her missing husband did little to quell the curiosity of her growing children or to stop rumors from cropping up in the rest of the family. Some believed that George had simply run away, like Dorothy said, possibly back to where he had served in the Korean War. Others, however, thought that there might be a more sinister explanation. In the 1980s, Dorothy's youngest son, Michael, purchased the family home from her. This would turn out to be a fateful decision, though one that would take several more decades to fully realize. It was after Dorothy's death in 1998 that the Carroll children really started to entertain the darkest possible explanation for their father's sudden disappearance, that he had never really left them at all. This theory was one that had been whispered amongst family members for years. Perhaps George was buried somewhere in the basement. Though the thought was certainly morbid, it wasn't simply random speculation. At the time that George had gone missing, construction was being done on the family house. Part of this included pouring new concrete in the basement. Eventually, the rumors became too much for Michael, who decided he was going to try and settle the mystery once and for all. In his search for answers, he even reached out to a psychic, as well as a team of paranormal investigators. He was told that there was a lot of energy emanating from his basement. In 2015, he finally began digging. It was a slow process, as he initially chose to dig alone and only worked on the project periodically. When he eventually used ground-penetrating radar to analyze the basement floor, the results seemed to suggest that he was on the right track. They indicated that there could be something 6 feet below. After suffering a stroke in the summer of 2018, Michael's 2 sons joined in on the dig. On October 30th, they found what they were looking for: a human skeleton. Michael informed his siblings of the discovery that night and told Suffolk County Police the following day. 2 months later, the family got the news they had been waiting for nearly 60 years. The bones discovered in the basement of the house were positively identified as belonging to George Carroll. According to the Suffolk County Medical Examiner, the DNA was extremely well preserved with George's skeletal remains, making for an easy identification. However, it was clear that the news had only solved half of the mystery surrounding George's death. An analysis of the remains led investigators to conclude that George had in fact been murdered, dying as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. Though the death had been declared a homicide, police had little to go on in terms of finding those responsible. Whatever secrets Dorothy had about the disappearance were long since lost with her death in 1998. The last remaining person who might have had any information about George's death was Dorothy's second husband, Richard Darris, who had passed away earlier in 2018. Despite the lack of any official conclusion to the case, the Carroll children would tell reporters that they were happy enough with the answers they had gotten and that they didn't want to speculate any further about what might have led to their father ending up where he did. Michael Carroll described feeling total peace after his discovery, saying, quote, "I feel great that my dad is finally free from that crappy hole." In the fall of 2019, George's body was laid to rest in the Calverton National Cemetery in Riverhead, New York. At least for now, it seems that this 60-year-old murder case is destined to remain a mystery.
Of all of the stories we came across while researching for this video, none was quite as unsettling or bizarre as the case of the so-called House of Horror. In 2006, police in Jersey, a British Crown dependency and the largest of the Channel Islands, began a covert investigation into allegations of child abuse at the island's care homes. The investigation would later come to be known as Operation Rectangle, a wide-ranging inquiry exploring decades of abuse allegations in Jersey beginning after World War II. In 2007, the States of Jersey police began paying specific attention to a youth hostel that had formerly served as a home for boys and girls during the 1960s and 70s. The home had been called Haute de la Garenne. However, it would quickly become known by a different name, following a series of shocking discoveries in early 2008, the House of Horror. Though the allegations of child abuse by former residents of Haute de la Garenne had managed to generate headlines in much of the UK up until this point, it was nothing compared to what followed, when in February of that year, reports began to emerge that investigators had uncovered skull fragments in cellars of the former children's home. This quickly escalated when more bone fragments were discovered, and began to be accompanied by other nightmarish details. According to reports, excavation of the building was uncovering additional rooms and cellars that had served as the site of unimaginable horrors. Inside, investigators were supposedly finding evidence of so-called punishment rooms, complete with restraints, shackles, and in one instance, a blood-stained bathtub. The gruesome details led many to fear that Haute de la Garenne had been the site of tens or even hundreds of child killings, and that the crimes had been concealed for decades. The lurid reports continued for months, with each subsequent news story seemingly containing more grisly findings than the last. Perhaps the most famous of these was some graffiti found on a wooden beam during the excavation that read, quote, "I've been bad for years and years." However, by May, it was clear that the details received by the public had been wildly misleading and inaccurate. Not only were none of the supposed punishment room items initially what they had seemed to be, there was no compelling evidence that any murders at all had taken place at Haute de la Garenne. Of the 170 bone fragments found at the site, scientific analysis showed that only 3 could be human, and that 2 of those might date back as far as the year 1470. The third bone fragment was estimated to be from anywhere between 1650 and 1950. The wooden beam with the haunting message on it also turned out to be misleading. It had only been added to the building in 2003, when Haute de la Garenne was being converted into a youth hostel. After spending well over £1 million on their investigation, the most compelling evidence of child murder the Jersey police had managed to find were some baby teeth that were believed to have been lost naturally by children. The supposed skull fragment that had exacerbated the panic turned out to be part of a coconut shell. However, the extremely bittersweet truth to the whole ordeal was that the allegations of child abuse that had started Operation Rectangle were very real. And now, the entire investigation suffered from a serious crisis of credibility. Following the revelations about the mishandling of the investigation, Jersey's chief of police, Graham Power, was suspended from his duties. In 2013, an entirely new investigation would be set up to deal with the abuse allegations in Jersey childcare homes, as well as to explore what had gone wrong with Operation Rectangle. This inquiry lasted for 138 days and heard from 650 witnesses, including many former residents of Haute de la Garenne. During the inquiry, men and women described being abused by staff members during their time at various Jersey care homes, sometimes being passed on to other sexual offenders. Physical and psychological abuse was common, and ranged from residents having their mouths washed out with antiseptic soap to being beaten with stinging nettles. In one particularly egregious case, a young girl had been forced to spend the entire night in a room with a dead body at a child care home run by nuns. As a result of the publicity surrounding the House of Horror case and the 2013 inquiry it prompted, several people went to prison. This included some former staff members of Haute de la Garenne, as well as others connected to instances of abuse and assault that took place at other care homes. This leaves the case with something of a complicated legacy. Though the investigation has been rightfully criticized for its obvious mismanagement and lack of credibility, it's worth questioning whether any of these abuse allegations would have been taken as seriously as they were, absent the horrifying stories of child murder that brought them to an international audience. Be sure to let us know your thoughts about this truly sad and bizarre case in the comments section below. That brings us to the end of our list. Do you know of any other cases like this that you'd like to see featured in a future video? Tell us about them in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. Thank you for watching.